Well, good morning again, church. Good morning. Well, a few weeks ago, right around the new year, we began a sermon series on the Gospel of John. The good news of one last surviving eyewitness who was right there with Jesus, who remembers Jesus, and throughout his entire good news, he's going to ask one question that we have to answer every time we look at who Jesus is. What do you make of him? Jesus, the way that we respond to Christ, there really is no room for middle ground. He's either of infinite worth or he's worthless. He's either everything or nothing. And every one of us has to answer that question. What do you make of him? So today, let's take a look at him by looking at John chapter 4. Would you hear the word of the Lord? So he, Jesus, left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. And now he had to go through Samaria. And so he came up to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. And when a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into the town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans." Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his livestock?" Jesus answered, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." And he told her, "Go, call your husband and come back." "I have no husband," she replied. Jesus said to her, "You are right when you say you have no husband, but the fact is, you have had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have said is quite true." "Sir," the woman said, "I can see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." "Woman," Jesus replied, "believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming, and has now come, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in the Spirit and in truth." The woman said, "I know that Messiah, called the Christ, is coming, and when he comes, he will explain everything to us." And then Jesus declared, "I, the one speaking to you, I am he." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. During this whole interaction between this woman and Jesus, just the two of them, it's a sequence of pushing and pulling. It's a sequence of Jesus inviting himself to be known and wanting to know this woman, and at the same time her drawing back and taking a step back from being known or from knowing him. It's a sequence, a push and pull. And in all of her objections, what we'll see in the midst of all of this chaos of conversation, we'll see three things: God's pursuit, our objections, and then finally God's final offer. God's pursuit, our objections, and then God's final offer. So let's look first at God's pursuit this morning. The opening verse of our passage, Jesus is on his way from the southern part of what we look at as Israel. He's on the south part going up north, up to a place in the Galilee. And on his way, he stops about halfway around noontime when the sun is hot and beating down on them. And he says, you know what, guys, let's stop for a lunch break. Why don't you guys go in and find lunch? I'm going to stay here. I need a water break. And so under the hot sun, they make a stop, but it's not exactly where they should have stopped. If you make a straight line between where he was and where he's going, the city of Sychar is right on the road. It's a exit ramp, within a quarter mile off the exit ramp kind of stop. And then a mile beyond Sychar, there's this well. It's a historic site for God's people. It's where one of the patriarchs had a well, Jacob. But it's a mile out of town. And as the sun is beating down on them, it's anything but reasonable, it's anything but logical for them to go an extra mile and back under the hot sun. And yet Jesus is insistent. He says, I must go there. And so he goes out of his way. And the only thing that the text points us to as to why he goes out of his way is there's this deep, abiding sense in Jesus' call to this woman that he has to show himself to her. He wants desperately for her to know him. These aren't the interactions that we think of with Jesus, with crowds surrounding him and thousands at a time getting to know him. This is just him and one other person with a deep conviction that she has to get to know him. So he goes out of the way, he goes to the well a mile out of town under the beating sun, all by himself at this point, and he asks her for a drink. And I think we lose a sense of the drama in this passage often. So we're going to try to recreate it a little bit today. Immediately when he asks her for a drink, as she's drawing up her bucket from the well, she drops everything and kind of takes a step back with a gasp and says, "How could you ask me for a drink?" The Samaritan woman said to him, "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" And if you're not familiar with what's going on here, we're just going to cover it really briefly. 700 years before Jesus, where they are right now in the northern part of the country of Israel was brutally conquered by another country, the Empire of Assyria. Brutally conquered. And their conquerors took everyone from the northern part of the country and enslaved them and brought them away to Assyria. And in the midst of that, after generations had gone by and these slaves now forgot who they were as Jews, and really they had become Assyrians by all means, the Assyrians sent them back, forgotten who they were, really a different kind of people altogether. And they came back to their old hometowns that their ancestors had been in. And they came back not empty-handed, but with all of these other religions in hand. And so what we see is that all of their neighbors to the south in Judea were all despising of their neighbors in Samaria. These Samaritans weren't really Jews anymore. They weren't really God's people anymore. They had forgotten who they were. And worst of all, they had forgotten who God was. In many ways, they had blended God as just one of the other gods, and so they were despised by the Jews. 700 years of animosity. 700 years of trading terrorist attacks between the two. 700 years of hatred. 700 years of rejection from one to the other. And so when we see Jesus sit down, a Jewish man, beside the well, and he sees a Samaritan woman, and he even dares to start a conversation, immediately the woman draws back. Because there's 700 years of animosity between the two. This isn't one woman's grudge against the Jews, this is her entire people. And they're both representatives. She wants nothing to do with him, and by all means, from her perspective, he should want nothing to do with her, but at the same time, still, Jesus goes out of his way, a mile in the beating sun, after a whole day of journey, just to strike up a conversation, just to see if there's a chance that they can talk. And the rest of the passage details our objections, her objections. Her objections to a relationship with this man who has come beside her. And in many ways, we'll see that her objections of this conversation with Jesus are really some of our objections that we ourselves experience today when we are offered a relationship with God. Some of you may feel these objections today. And if so, if you're struggling with what it means to be in a relationship with Jesus, I'm glad you're here. And some of you may not be struggling with these objections of a relationship with Jesus. And I'm really thankful for that. And if that's the case, no matter what, I guarantee you that our neighbors are struggling with these objections. There are people, coworkers, family members, people you'll pass in the street or in the grocery store who are struggling with these same objections that this woman did thousands of years ago. And so let's look at these two objections that she shows today. The two main reasons that people draw back when God draws near. First, the woman feels like she can't be in a relationship with God's people. The woman's already made this clear. We've already talked about this. She wants nothing to do with these people, God's people, Israel, the Jews. She wants nothing to do with them, and by all means, they should want nothing to do with her. They are happier on either sides of the room, never addressing the other. She wants nothing to do with God's people. And church, I don't know how to say this other than honestly. A lot of our neighbors, a lot of people want nothing to do with God's people today. They feel the same way about people who claim to follow Jesus. One of my favorite authors is Brennan Manning. Brennan Manning, he was a Catholic priest in the late 20th century, an author, a speaker, but he also was very open about his ongoing experience struggling with alcoholism. And he was brutally honest. In his books, he talks about one day at the heights of knowing who Jesus is, and the next day he is literally in the gutter. And in the midst of that, he talks about experiencing objection or the rejection of the church. He says this, the greatest single cause of atheism in the world today is not Christ, but Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips, walk out the door, and deny him by their lifestyle. That is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable. Manning had begun following Jesus in the 1960s, a time where the American church was deeply concerned with presenting itself as morally upright in the midst of changing times. And in the midst of their fervent attempt to be morally upright as opposed to their neighbors, it was also a generation that experienced a lot of rejection from the church. He would find himself in AA meetings, overhearing this common theme of rejection in the midst of their struggles. Not rejection by their neighbors or their coworkers or even their family members. The one dominant theme that ran through it all was all of these men and women had grown up as boys and girls in the church. And because they began to wrestle with the brokenness of their lives that was beginning to bump up against other people in the church didn't know what to do with them in their fervent attempt to be morally upright, and so the church drew back, and so did they. Manning makes the point that most people aren't objecting to Jesus. They're open to a relationship with Jesus, and all the while, they can't imagine being in a relationship with us. And that's hard. And I say us, meaning us, me and you. There's a whole generation, there's a whole people that feel as if they don't fit here. That feel, whether it was spoken or unspoken, that they can't imagine being in a relationship with Jesus alongside us. They can imagine being in a relationship with Jesus, but not while they feel the hot eyes of people who are more concerned about moralism than their relationship with a living God. Manning calls this a tragedy. Because how can we say that we follow a God who pursues us in all of our brokenness, who loves us while we were still sinners, and at the same time treat people in all of their sin and brokenness as if they were anything but the loved and pursued people that they are to God? It's a tragedy that still exists today. This woman isn't rejecting a relationship with Jesus. Her first objection is because Jesus represents a people who have rejected her. That's the tension at the well. She can't imagine being in relationship with God's people, even though she can imagine being in a relationship with God. She can't get over the idea of being in a relationship with God's people. And many of us still struggle in the same way. And yet Jesus keeps pursuing her. And we see the second of her objections. The second of her objections is that she fears that she can't be honest about her brokenness. Jesus begins asking her questions that slowly unveil some of the broken parts of her life. Jesus offers this woman at the well living water. As she's sweating and getting these gets up from the well, and she's struggling to do what she's trying to do, and all the while, he says, you know what would it look like if you didn't have to do this anymore? Because I asked you for water, but if you knew who I was, you would know that I could offer you water that would somehow mean that you would never thirst again, meaning that you would never have to come back day after day carrying this water a mile out of town. What would it look like for you to receive living water? And of course, this gets the woman's attention. She says, finally, you're speaking my language. Finally, you're offering me something that I know that I need. Because before, I didn't know if I wanted a conversation with you, but at the same time, what I really want is this living water. That will impact my life. Give me this water. Give me this water, sir, so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water. And Jesus says, great, there's just one thing that we need to talk about. Would you go and get your husband and bring him back so that you guys can have this living water together? Would you just go and get your husband and then we can do this together? And she immediately has to start backtracking. She says, sir, I don't have a husband. And Jesus doesn't let her go when she starts giving him half answers. He gives the other half to her. He says to her, you are right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you've had 5 husbands. And the man that you now have, meaning the man that you're living with now, is not your husband. What you have just said is quite true. Basically, Jesus, when she gives him a half answer, he gives the other half back, basically saying, why are you holding yourself back? Why are you pretending to be someone that you're really not? Why are you only taking one half step toward me when I'm willing to be here, right here with you? I will receive you just as you are if you would just give me your whole story. But you're only willing to give me half of it, so let me show you that I understand the other half. And so Jesus begins telling the woman's narrative back to her. This woman would have been the talk of her town. This sin of going from man to man, even, some commentators note, even if they are passing away in the meanwhile, the reason why she is with a man at the very end but not betrothed to him, not married to him, she would have been known as this promiscuous woman. The one that people whisper about as they pass by. Jesus immediately picks up on her small little attempt to clean up her story, to only offer half, the prettier half of the story. Why are you trying to be someone you're not? And of course, the answer in the story from ground level is that you wouldn't offer who you really are to this man who just offered you this great gift. What if when he understands you in all of your mess, what if he withdraws his offer? What if all of a sudden, all the grace that he just offered you of this living water is off the table? What if all of this grace was revoked? And therein lies the second great objection to God's pursuit of us. Because if we let God get too close, if we become honest about who we really are, laying ourselves in front of God with all of our broken actions, thoughts, and motivations right in front of Him, that when God finally gets a good look at us, He'll take a step back. And that might seem like it's a far cry from your own experience, but I guarantee you there are people right here that feel that every day. And if we can feel it here, how much more so do our neighbors, friends, coworkers, family members feel it? There are so many times when people come into this room and feel like they need to only tell the first prettier half of their story. And all the while, God shows his entire self to us. Why would we ever think that we need to only share a portion of ourselves to him? There's a deep, abiding fear that once God gets a look at us, he'll leave. And it's one thing to fear the rejection of God's people. After all, people are broken. People can do wrong things. But this objection of when God starts to draw near you, God himself will reject you, that kind of fear is an entirely different thing. That kind of fear will cause a lifetime of never fully presenting yourself to God. The fear that if you dare take a step forward, he'll take a step back. That if you dare to reach out for God to save you, that at the same time he'll cross his arms, being despised with you, shaking his finger at you. That is fear that many of us go back and forth from. That God is somehow on the fence about you. That you can only ever tell the prettier half of your story, but never present yourself fully to God, lest he walk away from you. And at the same time, the conversation continues. Jesus never rejects her. He says, I see all the brokenness in your life. I know what the people say around town. And he wants her to see that he stays knowing all of it. He wants her to know him despite all of her objections. He stays. He says, I'm not going anywhere. You have 1,000 reasons to be uncomfortable with me being here, but let me make you a bit more comfortable. I can see you in all of your brokenness. I can see you in all of your fears and objections, all the worries about what a relationship with me would look like. And all the while, I'm not going anywhere. I'll stay right here because all I want is for you to know me. You're so afraid that all your fears will be realized, that either God's people will reject you or that God himself will throw you away, and yet here I am. And I'm not going anywhere. To close, because we see this narrative, and really if you want the full story, you need to go home and read the rest of chapter 4. This woman's life is incredible after this. This is a turning point in her life when the God who has presented himself fully to her says, I know all of you in all of your fullness, all of your brokenness, and I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying right here to be in relationship with you. It's the turning point of her whole life. She is wildly fanatic about a God who is wildly in love with her. You need to go home and read the rest. But to close today, what does God's offer of a relationship with you look like? With you, with me, with our neighbors, with our coworkers, with our friends, our family members? What does that offer look like despite all of our fears and objections? Well, after she tries to change the topic about mountains, and she says, sir, I can see that you're a prophet. I can see that you know all about my life, and I'm not exactly sure how because I don't think I've met you before. How about we start talking about where we should worship? And he says, stop changing the subject. Stop changing the subject. I'm right here. You could ask me anything, and you're worried about mountains. Church, we get equally distracted. We start caring about all these things on the periphery. And Jesus is right here. And we can have a relationship with him today. This woman was sent on fire for who Jesus was, and she turned her whole town into worshipers of this living God who she met. She said, you've got to meet him. Why aren't we leaving the room like that? It's because we get distracted by all these other things, all our fears, our objections. We get distracted and we forget about the God who says, I'm right here. Jesus ends the narrative. She says, you know what? The Messiah will come one day and he'll explain everything to us. And he says, I'm the one you're looking for. You're going from man to man, looking for someone to make sense out of this life, to make order out of chaos, to feel loved. You're going from person to person, trying desperately to avoid the judgment that you fear, and at the same time, I'm right here. I know all of your story, and I'm not leaving. I'm the one you've been waiting for. God in the flesh, ready to be known. And Jesus extends the same invitation to you and me today at roughly 11. Don't get distracted by all your fears, your objections, or all the other things that can distract you away from who Jesus is offering himself for you to be today. God wants you to know him. He will go to every length to be known, and all we need to do if you want to know him, to accept the offer, is keep looking at Christ. If you want to know what God looks like, keep looking at his Son. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Would you pray with me for a moment? Jesus, we thank you for who you are and who you've revealed yourself to be and who you continue